have our study Dr. Florence Gillman. Dr. Gillman has been a docent at the Timken since 2022 and has been a member of USD's faculty since 1986. At USD, Dr. Gillman has served as chair of the Department of Theology and Religious Studies, the coordinator of the program in Interdisciplinary Humanities, and the coordinator of the program in Classics. So thank you, Dr. Gillman, and I'll hand it over to you now.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah. Thanks for all of those. I can see, I know I just got a chat message from Ryan in Hawaii. I don't know if I see you, I don't see you, but hi, Ryan in Hawaii. And hi to everyone else as you gradually come in. So we're going to talk about some interesting information kind of occasioned by the fact that the Timken has this painting. As you can see, it's a very detailed painting, very engrossing painting. And I notice the days that I'm in the museum as a docent, I notice that when people walk past it, it makes them stop. They don't just walk past it. There's something about it, probably because it is so starkly light and dark, that but that it has this big block in the center of it also. It really stops people, and they kind of wonder, I think, what is going on in this painting. So now I have already given 2 lectures about this painting, various aspects of what it relates to, and you can find those if you would like to see those also. You can find those on the Timken's Facebook page. If you look under events and you click on past, you will see all kinds of recorded programs, including the 2 that I did on Savoldo's occasion by Savoldo's St. Anthony. The reason there's so much to say about Savoldo's St. Anthony is that St. Anthony was a historical figure. And besides that, became extremely famous and occasioned not only a lot of art, but literature and some other interesting and important ideas. So that's why actually at this point I have a whole series of lectures on him. All right, so looking at the painting first for just a minute. And I've got to be able to, sorry, I'm having trouble. There it goes. Okay, and let's just note a few things about the artist, Savoldo. He was a Italian, and the dates you can see here for his life, 1480 to 1548. He was painting in Venice. He was part of what is called the Venetian Renaissance. And unfortunately, we don't know an awful lot about him. And we don't really know why he painted this painting. We generally know why. St. Anthony was very, very popular, but we don't exactly know who commissioned this painting. We don't know the whole history of it, and so on. So what we do know is that the painter Titian was very dominant in Venice at the time, and that may have caused Savoldo to be more of an artist in the shadows. So we don't know an awful lot about him. But when we look at the painting, some questions are definitely suggested. For example, the right side of the painting, which is a dark world, which is in many ways suggestive of a dangerous world, of a world where awful things seem to be happening. A world also, if you can see in the lower part, the lower right of the picture especially, you can see also there's a lot of little figures and strange figures, unreal figures, sort of figures suggesting maybe tormenting, almost a hellish kind of a scene, which rings bells of Hieronymus Bosch. So there's always the question of whether Savoldo was impacted by Hieronymus Bosch. There is no conclusive evidence, and there's no evidence that they ever met, although some people think that through his wife, Savoldo may have come in contact with either Bosch or somehow seen some of his works. In any case, we get this sense in the lower right, this hellish sense. And you see over here, it looks as if people are escaping something. And you see terrible portents of destruction in the back. Whereas on the other side over here, it's beautiful light, beautiful mountain scene, clear blue sky, and so on. Obviously, this is St. Anthony. He's moving to the left. He's moving into the lighter part. The implication seems to be that he has either had a vision into the right side, or he's been in the right side, and he is running away from it. So indeed, the real St. Anthony, as I will tell you about him, had some kind of similar experiences. We will come back to the painting a number of times, but let me point out before we leave it that it is not by accident, in my opinion, that the cave up here is shaped as it is. So when I show you the real cave of Anthony, you will see that it has a very narrow opening. Yeah. A person with kind of a normal waist can fit through, but persons with large waists would not be able to go in easily. Okay, so we'll come back to this numerous times, but I put in a couple close-ups here also so you can see possibly some closer photos of the images. And down here especially, it looks like people running away, escaping from some hellish situation. So, but we don't really know what he meant. Okay, now we're going to go to the historical Anthony. We'll come back to the medieval Anthony, in other words, his popularity later. But let's go to the real Anthony because he is an historical person. So as you can see by the dates, he lived in the mid-3rd to mid-4th century. And if you do the math quickly, you'll see the suggestion is that he died at the age of 105. Whether or not that's absolutely accurate has always been a question. But nevertheless, whatever his actual dates were, he crosses over late 3rd into the early 4th century. And this was a period for Christianity as it was developing, in which huge issues had occurred. First of all, Christianity, for most of its first 300 years, had undergone sporadic persecutions. The Roman Empire never persecuted all Christians everywhere and every place at once. But there were sporadic persecutions of Christians here and there. One of the worst was near the end of the 200s. But then all of a sudden, with the accession of Constantine to the throne of the Roman emperor in the early 300s, and first with his edict of toleration of religion, and then in the 330s with his own conversion to Christianity, Christianity, in a sense, came out of the doldrums of the fears of persecution out onto a sunlit plain where it was very acceptable, desirable to be a Christian. And if you were part of the upper classes around Constantine, or if you wanted to advance in Roman administration and so on, becoming Christian was to your advantage. But becoming Christian then there were new reasons for becoming Christian that did not necessarily include belief. And that was very hard for the quote real Christians to experience that there had been a radical social shift around them in how people became and lived Christianity. So Anthony himself, as a young person in that climate, to some extent, he was born and lived in what we would call northern Egypt, um, to the west of Alexandria today. When Anthony heard the reading of the gospel where Jesus urges the young rich man who says, "What should I do to be perfect?" When Anthony heard that reading, it really hit him hard because Jesus said, "Go sell what you have, give to the poor, and come follow me." And so Anthony was one of those people, and there are others in history who have taken that advice absolutely literally and who have made enormous impact in their own way. So Anthony decided to he was rather well off. His parents had died and left him with good resources. He had a sister who was younger, so he set her up with a group of women to live with a group of women. He funded it, and then he gave everything else away. And then he himself began the life of a wandering pilgrim kind of person. And he moved further and further west along the Mediterranean coast into the desert areas. And he lived in like the ruins of cemeteries and places like that. So he became gradually more and more of a wandering kind of hermit type character. Now, eventually he moves south in Egypt to an area of mountain caves near the Red Sea. And his cave, which I said, which in the artwork is in Savoldo's art, seems to me relatively accurate. His cave was a tall, narrow opening near the top of the cliff of the cliffs along the Red Sea coast on the internal side of the cliffs. So he was not looking down at the Red Sea, he was looking down at the Nile, the plain leading over to the Nile. First, I'm going to make a long story short and then I'll back up. So, to make a long story short, is after 20 years living as a cave dweller and living as a hermit, because people had kept coming to him, asking him to guide them in their quest to be hermits, also. After 20 years, he became like a spiritual guide known as an Abba, a father. And he moved down onto the plain area and lived somewhat of a community life with others learning to be hermits. So he became kind of their spiritual director. And I use the phrase learning to be hermits because it's not easy to be a hermit. It's not simple every day to find something to eat, something to drink. And furthermore, it is a psychologically perilous journey, as we will see in some of the art. In other words, the person, in Anthony's case, he experienced extremely scary, dangerous, you could say, dreams or temptations and so on. So yeah, he died in old age and he was buried secretly. We don't know for sure where he was buried. So he becomes very, very well known, not just because of the hermits that he directed, and there were a lot of them. Did you know that in the Egyptian desert in the 300, late 200s, early 300s, there were literally thousands of people, hermits, both men and women. Um, these were the real beginnings, the real initial, what we say, the real initial people who laid the groundwork for Christian monasticism, which Christian monasticism is extremely important in the history of not only Christianity, but civilization, because of what the monks and the nuns have done in terms of teaching and preserving the tradition. So, so he becomes famous is later on, he begins to be called the father of monasticism. And this is impacted in a few ways that I'll show you. First, let me show you a little more art about him. So here you see a panel from a triptych that is now in Siena. And this is the artist who's popularly known as Il Sassetto. And what he's painting is that aspect of Anthony's life where he is tormented, taunted, teased by strange beings, by devilish type beings, by awful creatures. And normally the temptation is to stop doing what you're doing and do what we say, and you become the richest person you can imagine, and you will have wealthy food, wonderful food, and wonderful clothes, and a wonderful place to live. The Great Temptations, sort of paralleling the story in the Gospels in the New Testament, where the devil takes Jesus and torments him and tempts him. So this aspect of Anthony's life is in quite a few paintings. And here's another one. This is Michelangelo's version of possible torments of Anthony. And you see that here he's raised up and surrounded by strange devilish beings, and probably the idea that Michelangelo wants to convey is he's looking down on the beautiful earth below, on the Nile below, and being tempted to forsake being a hermit, forsake being a radical disciple of Jesus, and go live a wonderful life in the beautiful Nile Valley. This one's in Texas, yeah. Now, this one's pretty interesting too, because this also adds to part of his story. And that is when after Anthony had become a solitary being, kind of hermit, already in the northern part of Egypt, people told him that there was already a hermit in the Egyptian desert whose name was Paul of Thebes. And here you see in the title of this painting the more technical term for hermits, which is anchorite. So people told him there was this anchorite, Paul of Thebes, way down in the Egyptian desert, and that he was more of a hermit than Anthony was. Now, how could a hermit be more of a hermit? Well, that was Anthony's question himself. It's like, what else do I need to do to be? What else can I do that's radical? And so Anthony took a journey down into the Egyptian desert to find Paul. And this painting memorializes their meeting. So this is an interesting painting because it's a journey painting. If you look over here, you can see way over here in the corner, you can see Anthony on his way. Okay, he comes along this path, and here he comes, and here he has met. Here he is with Paul. And according to the story, Paul only had a half piece of a flat, what we would call pita bread, unleavened bread every day. But this time with the meeting with Anthony, oh, and a raven brought it to Paul. But this time the raven brought a whole piece. So brought a whole piece for them to share. And you can see in this you can see a Eucharistic dimension if you want, bread given from heaven. You can see something like that if you want to read that into it, if that's what the artist intended. The story certainly seems to intend that. The other part of the story that's here is that when Anthony was with Paul at one point, when he came upon him, he actually found Anthony dead. Anthony had died, he actually found Paul dead. So here's Paul dead and Anthony finding him. Now, the story says that the miracle that happened was some lions in the desert helped dig the grave so that Anthony could bury Paul. And that's what you see happening here. Later on, when we look at some medieval paintings, we'll notice the lions in those too. Artists tend to put lions into these desert paintings to heighten the dangers of the desert. Yeah, so anyway, let's go to the map now. And let's put all this on the map and expand it in a direction that I have not taken before, especially for those of you who might have heard the first two lectures. So Anthony is he grows up here in the region west of Alexandria. By the way, that is still a very important monastic area. He was not the only one, of course, who became a monk in the whole history of Egyptian monasticism, which is a huge history, and we know lots about it, and it is still extremely vibrant. Okay, a big piece of that history is and still is here west of Alexandria. But as I said, he decides to go to Thebes. He decides to look for Paul. He decides to go farther into the desert, farther and farther away from civilization. And so he goes way down here to ancient Thebes right here. So notice the location. I bet some of you have been here because this is modern Luxor. And if you've been in Egypt, surely you've been to Luxor because on the west bank of the Nile is the Valley of the Kings and King Tut's tomb and all that. And it's the rare tour today, I think, that stops focusing on the history of the pharaohs and puts in also the other interesting, fascinating history, particularly in this part of Egypt, of Christianity and monasticism. Anyway, it's called Luxor today. It's called Thebes then. Those of you who know ancient history know that there's another Thebes, which is in Greece. And so we want to distinguish, we don't want to confuse that because that's an important site in classical history. Okay, just look again now. You notice that it's called the Diocese of Egypt about 400 AD. So this is the Byzantine, who are the successors of the Romans, of course. This is the Byzantine division of political division. So they're the ones who are using the term Diocese of Egypt. And you see that it has various partitions. Okay. Let me remind you that when we're talking about Egypt, south is upper and north is lower because the Nile is flowing north, it is flowing downhill. So when you go south, you're going up. You're going up into more hilly country. And as you can see on this map, very hilly actually. So here's the ridge of cliffs where Anthony's cave was, somewhere still is, to the east of Thebes. Now, I already put out a lot of information. How about before I keep going, how about if we take a break, Sarah, and see if there's any questions or clarifications? Can we do that, please?
Yes. It doesn't.
Anybody want to ask any questions?
I don't have any here right now. But if
Okay, that's fine. I'll keep going.
All right.
If you do have a question, put it in chat. And otherwise, you can keep it to the end, or I'll stop again.
Oh,
All right, so here we have the lay of the land anyway. So Anthony's cave is over here. Now, because the latter couple decades of his life, he spent most of the time down on the plain, you could say, with the monks that he was guiding. This eventually formed a monastery. So that monastery has never ceased existing. It's called the Monastery of St. Anthony. You can see it's quite developed today, and you can go there. It's a very important center today for not only the hundreds of monks who are there, but for Coptic Christians who are the Egyptian Christians, who are a large but now minority of Egyptians. Most Egyptians, because of the Muslim conquests, became Islamic, but especially the southern half of Egypt is very Coptic. So you can go to this place and you can be shown and go up into the hills and actually see the cave that Anthony lived in. The monks of the monastery themselves do have times when they themselves go and spend some hermit time in caves. Sometimes people think that when monks or nuns become hermits, that they're trying to get away from humanity, but that's not the idea at all. The idea of being a monastic and a hermit at times is to face reality without any distractions. Face reality, face evil, opt for good. It is somewhat of I would say it has somewhat of a military almost sense to it of I need to be alone to face what I want to face. So it isn't a rejection of human community at all. It's quite an interesting thing to think about and to study. This is another picture today. So Anthony of the area. So while I have not been here myself, I intend to be there at some point. I have been in Egypt, but at the time could not get permission to get up in this part of it. But anyway, the cave is up in here, in this area. I have seen a video that you might want to track down. I put the link to it in one of my other talks on this subject, where two men decided to redo what Anthony did. So they begin in North Egypt. They go to the various sites where he was a monk. Then they go down here. They actually get up to the cave and so on. You might want to track down that video. And I'm sure you can just by tracking YouTube. Go to YouTube. It's on YouTube, and track down Egyptian monasticism. Okay, now how do we know so much about Anthony? Well, there was a bishop of Alexandria named Athanasius in the 300s who was Anthony's friend and followed his whole life and wrote Anthony's story, and why it was widely copied. It was sent all over the Mediterranean countries. Eventually, in the 13th century, it became part of what is the famous book called the Golden Legend. So I'll show you a picture of that. I think I have one. The Golden Legend was a big book, sort of like the stories of the saints. And so that promoted him even more. But here's Athanasius in a 10th century fresco from Constantinople. So Athanasius on the left and Cyril. These were very important church figures of the 4th century. So when Athanasius was the bishop of Alexandria, he wrote the story of Anthony when he was in exile at one point himself. And he had known Anthony personally. So he tells very vivid stories about Anthony's encounters, Anthony's psychological torments, supposedly by the devil, whatever. And when he got done writing, he said these were only a few of the tales about Anthony that he knew. But his book inspired many, many figures in Christianity, including the famous Augustine. This is what a copy of the Golden Legend looks like. This is one of the ones in the Laurentian Library in Florence, Italy. And these are big, thick, huge books with stories of saints and others, truly treasures of medieval lore, repeating ancient lore. Now, the people who follow Anthony, the monks who followed him, the early monks, we call them the Desert Fathers. And they stay after he died, there's thousands of them. And some became famous as like spiritual guides and so on. And their stories were written and told too. So and their sayings especially. There were a lot of sayings that were copied, quoted, and we still have compilations of those, the sayings of the Desert Fathers. The actual monastery of St. Anthony was begun, humble beginnings, very tiny buildings and so on, at the end of the 3rd century. There weren't many buildings. The emphasis was on them being hermits, but they would get together to meet in the center for liturgy, to celebrate the Eucharist together, and for some spiritual direction. That form of living still exists, and I will show you one example of that eventually. They ate in the same place. In a monastery, you call that room a refectory. You can call it a dining room too, but tends to still have the term refectory. They ate together and developed some community with each other. And that was important because one of the hard things about being a hermit is danger. So if you need help, somebody has to know where you are and what you're doing and so on. And convenience. Maybe you live in a very remote place, but you have to have a source of water. You have to have a source of food. Maybe there's somebody who brings you some food every once in a while, and you depend on that. So it isn't so simple to be a hermit. Now, over time, of course, Anthony's hermit followers became less solitary as monks, became somewhat communal, had some cooperative activities, you could say, where they would probably, feed people or help desert travelers or whatever. Okay, back to the map then, and okay. The way I want to go now is very different from what I talked about before also, and that is I want to talk about this region as it's called the Thebais. So we're going to now talk about Thebaids, and those are a special form of art that picks up on all of this about Anthony and his monks, picks up on the geography of the area, and so on, and leads us to some very interesting paintings. So, a Thebaid is a painting. It has a rocky landscape, usually has caves. It has a lot of monks doing a lot of things. So these become popular in medieval Europe. And I want to show you some of the interesting ones. So remember, I already made this other point that's on this slide, and that is, don't confuse this with Thebes and Greece. That's another whole story. Okay, here's the landscape. Get it in your head, and now see what the paintings are like. Okay, so here's the landscape, the pictures of the monastery. And I had two pictures also more historical from Dumbarton Oaks in the 30s. This is standing up at Anthony's cave. You can see his view. You can see the Nile over here in the distance. And this is the actual cave. So you can see what I meant when I was saying it's elongated, narrow. Yeah. So it is said that a person, as I mentioned, that a person who's a little bit heavy would have trouble getting in here. So that must be further in. Like I said, I haven't been to this cave yet, although I intend to go. Okay, this is another one of the ancient monasteries that survived. Now to the Thebaids. So in 14th century Italy, there was a lot of interest in hermits. And one of those kind of resurgences in Christianity where some people feel compelled to express their dedication and their desire to follow Jesus literally by giving away everything and becoming a hermit. So these were especially interesting, are especially interesting to look at in the 14th century. So this led to some frescoes about them in various cities. And yeah, we're going to look at the one in Pisa and first here. So now, these artists had not been to the Thebaid. They had not been to Anthony's cave. That's why I emphasize what it looked like. So in your mind, you know what the terrain looks like. But when you see these, you will see that these artists had not been there. But they paint what they think it might have been like, which is more like cliffs someplace in Europe. But it's okay. But we just have to understand what's going on. Also, I told you they like to add lions to the rocky wilderness because, first of all, lions are in the story of Anthony, but also it seems to add to the distance, the remoteness, the danger. The Thebaids we're going to look at, some may have been like commissioned for a monastery communal room, a big room in a monastery where it would be an exemplar of what monks do, or maybe for a family chapel. These would not work so well in a church. These need to be someplace where you can walk up to them closely and see what's going on. Some of them are mentioned in literature, and I would just say, although I won't talk about this today, that over time, unfortunately, some Thebaids, because they're big, have been cut up and sold piece by piece. And today, various art historians are working to, at least first on paper, put them back together to reassemble them. Okay, here's the first Thebaid we're going to look at. This one is at the Getty, Lorenzo Costa. This is a pen and brown ink etching. Okay, so he describes it as monks and hermits in a landscape. So the difference between a monk and a hermit is a hermit, of course, is a monk who's all alone most of the time, whereas the monks live more communally, literally at the bottom of the hill, and help people and help each other and so on. And occasionally go up to see the hermit to take the hermit food or water or whatever. Look over here and you notice a dove and you see two people. All right, that is Anthony and Paul of Thebes. That is this artist's version of that painting I showed you, where the dove is bringing the loaf, the piece of pita type bread to them to share. So that is Anthony in the picture. Now, all kinds of other things are happening, and I'm sure we could try to make an analysis of the picture and see what types of activities Costa is suggesting were going on. You can see how this might work well in the room of a monastery or in a family room of a large room of a family, where you can talk about what all the people are doing and tell their stories and be hopefully inspired by them. So Costa, yeah, in portraying the Thebaid, he has got a lot of monks in that painting, as you noticed, and he shows interesting landscape of grottos, huts, and caves. It's all imaginary. But we saw Paul and Anthony in the upper left and receiving the bread from the raven. Indeed, the landscape seems more European than Egyptian. Okay, now, this is probably the most famous Thebaid. Well, maybe one of the two most famous. As you can see, this one's in the Uffizi in Florence. I have written that it's by Fra Angelico, but you see the subtitle shows, or the subline shows, that it was attributed to an artist named Gerardo Starnina. And yeah, this goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Who really painted this? Right now, as far as I can tell, the consensus seems to be Fra Angelico. So now notice the size of this. So it's 73 by 208 centimeters. That's really big. And we can see from the terrain that Fra Angelico picked that he hasn't been there. He hasn't been in the Egyptian desert. And what he has painted again is the rocky cliffs of something maybe he has seen in Europe, in Italy. But what he has done is he's painted a lot of small buildings, so he doesn't think of hermits and caves so much up here maybe, but up here maybe. Mostly little buildings, little huts, constructed far better than any of the reed huts that the monks ever made in the desert. But he's showing all kinds of activity. Now I'm going to try to break this in half. Okay, so it's not like this at all. Okay, here's half the painting so that you can see it better. And here we see the death of a monk. We don't know for sure who it is, and we see represented in the figures, for example, the various different orders of monks here. And we could probably look at this all day. We see a monk in a wheelchair here. We see a monk here who looks a little bit like a Franciscan with his rope around his brown habit and so on. All of these things, all of these various types of monks and everything about them, of course, would have been developed centuries and centuries after the real Anthony. Churches are actually in the picture too, chapels. Now the other side of the picture, let's see, yeah, it works okay here. Here you can see, this is also very European with a nearby water. And so on. So this is a gorgeous painting. And notice what the Uffizi has done in displaying it. I think this is really, really interesting way to display it. They've moved it down to child level. They've protected it with glass, but it can function just like it may have for the people for whom Fra Angelica painted it, only for children. They can walk up to it. They can try to figure out what the figures in it are doing. They can, to the extent somebody knows any of the stories of the monks, they might be able to relate them here and there to a character. They can look for the lions if they're there and other animals. So this is what the Uffizi has done with it, which is pretty neat. Okay, I think we need to stop now again for a couple minutes, and then I will come back and we will do about 15 more minutes, maybe less. Okay, I'm really looking forward to your questions or comments. I know you're out there. I
Thank
see one in chat.
Yes.
Um,
We also had one more from Dominic who direct messaged me a little bit earlier. He asked, how much do you think that Savoldo may have interpreted Saint Anthony's Torment through any possible difficulties Europe may have been experiencing at the time, or possibly what Savoldo himself may have been grappling with?
oh, okay, Dominic, I can see you on my screen. Actually, hi. Um, okay, what I forgot to talk about or could talk about in the initial remarks about Anthony is that he became, in the Middle Ages, he became a patron saint of people with skin diseases. And especially around the time of the bubonic plague and later, you know, I don't know if we can even begin to imagine the desperation of people who had no defense against the bubonic plague, no medical defense. I don't think we can imagine how awful it must have been, but they held on to the help of various saints. And if you prayed to the saint, if you made a donation to this saint's causes and so on, um, maybe the saint would help you. And so Savoldo knew this, and the other artists knew, oh, they knew all kinds of lore about Anthony and there's all kinds of descriptions of the visions and the awful things that the person experienced. And yeah, the paintings are picking up on details in the stories. So the artist isn't necessarily inventing every idea they are, but they also the artists, by the time they're painting Anthony, they know the stories of many other monks too, and the vivid kind of vision or scary. We might say their mind is playing tricks on them or something like that. But yeah, they know a lot about this. So, oh, also there's a question on here, a very good question about the sense of movement and time in the painting. And this question's coming from, I can't see what his name is here. But anyway, he's saying Anthony is moving fast to the left. And if he stopped for just a moment, they would catch him. And it's odd that he goes left, which is sinistra, yes, in Latin sinistra, but he is moving to his right. That is such a good question. I'm gonna go back to the painting. I hope I can make this work. Let's try this again. Okay, let's go back to the painting again. Nope, I lost it. How did I lose it? I got to go all the way back. Okay. Yeah, one aspect we didn't talk about that's so important is look at Anthony. And as the questioner has said, he's moving to the right. Many people think this represents the monastery that commissioned the painting. And he's moving toward the beautiful light. He's moving toward peace, moving toward the monastery, but he's looking back. So the movement is to the right, yes, but there's a mitigation of the movement right here. He's looking back. So is the artist also saying, and I notice people when I ask them in the museum, when I ask them about analyzing the movement, a number of people say the same sort of thing. He's looking back. Is it because he's tempted to go back? Is he tempted to give in to whatever these awful temptations were? Why is he looking back? And really, the Savoldo leaves us with that question, doesn't he? Why? How come he's looking back? So the movement is really interesting. He's going fast this way, but look at that. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that question. And I'll go back online, back to the sequence here. But furthermore, we're still stopped. Does anybody else have a question or a comment? Okay, then let's go back. Here is another famous Thebaid. Whoops, I'm trying to get the chat off. Okay, this is Uccello's Thebaid. I think I need to go up a page. Yeah. Okay, now this one's in Firenze in Florence, and this one is also 1400s, 15th century. And yeah, this one is not as large, about half the size of the previous one, but still a very large painting. Large painting that you could walk up to and intently look at and analyze with a lot of actions going on. And notice monks I don't think we know or which monastery presumably this was painted, but you see a lot of white-robed monks, which would suggest possibly Dominicans. But then you see some grayish ones here, more grayish, light brown maybe. Yeah, so we don't know for sure. Here we have a kind of a better suggestion of the Thebaid, of the terrain. Probably this painter knows that there is a monastery there that developed from Anthony's time there, but he's certainly made it more elaborate than anything that was there in the 1400s. Okay, so this one too is a very interesting composition with a lot to talk about and a lot to analyze. So this had a subtitle or another title called The Life of the Holy Hermits. And yeah, Benedict, Bernard, Jerome, Francis are all in here, and we could look at those sections that are known to recognize them. So this is it is also known as recognizing the orders that were common in Florence. And it is known that this was painted for a certain specific monastery, San Giorgio, and then went to the Uffizi and is now in the Accademia. Okay, this one is really unbelievably interesting, and this has a whole huge story to it. So one of the most famous Thebaids is in Pisa, and it's in a structure known as the Camposanto Monumental. So maybe you've been there. Maybe you remember in Pisa what the layout is like. Most everybody who goes to Pisa wants to go see the Leaning Tower. Well, the Leaning Tower leans next to the Cathedral of Pisa, and the Cathedral of Pisa has the phenomenal building called the Baptistry in front of it. Well, this is also part of that complex, the Camposanto Monumental, which probably gets less attention. Well, everything probably gets less attention than the tower, but the whole place is an extraordinary example of church, of the wonderful church history here. So anyway, the Camposanto was supposed to be a monumental cemetery, as opposed to something like a city cemetery. Monumental meant, yeah, for really, really important monuments in the cemetery. So Camposanto translates holy field. And they claimed that after the Third Crusader, or during it in the 12th century, that some crusaders had brought back soil from Golgotha, and that this was laid in this area. Whether or not that is accurate, I'm not sure anybody has tested the question. In any case, that's what the claim is. So yeah, monumental distinguishes it from Pisa's city cemetery. And basically, as you could see in that picture, it's a huge oblong cloister. So, and the walls are covered with frescoes. So here's where a Thebaid comes in. So this is the most famous monumental Thebaid. So in a monument of, and you see the artist was Buffalmacco, 1400s. Yeah, sure enough, when Thebaids were really, really popular. And he painted this as part of the decoration of this monumental cemetery. Now, what you're seeing is, like many frescoes, it is deteriorating badly. And you see, like the others, that it's more a European landscape than the cliffs of Upper Egypt, the cliffs along the Red Sea. It's very unlike that. But it is the type of painting, along with the others, where the artist can fit into it so many stories, and a person can walk up to it and see so much going on. It's like a beehive of activity. A beehive of activity is about the last thing that a bunch of hermits wanted on their hillside. But artists have to put an awful lot into one painting, right? So they paint a beehive of activity of hermits. The story about this, though, is pretty sad. Pretty sad, but pretty hopeful, maybe. So this is the central section of it, kind of. It's not a real sharp picture, but it's about the best one I can find that I can use in the common public domain. And so you get some idea of the quality of it and the type of action figures you can see. So Buffalmacco, yeah. Unfortunately, his work was damaged by an Allied bomb. So if you recall, the Allies were fighting against the Axis. So we, the Allies, were bombing Italy, and the bomb damaged the walls and the frescoes of the Camposanto Monumental. It was awful. And as you see in the facts I listed, it was burning for 3 days. So what has survived is we're pretty lucky it survived, but the recovery has been very painstaking. And since 1944, since the destruction, the Thebaid frescoes were never reinstalled until 2014. I do not know if further work is going on now with them, but we're very lucky to have what we do. I could go on and on, but I think I better stop. And let me just close with telling you, I'm guessing maybe some of you have the question, are there people who live like Anthony today? Are there still hermits? Yes, there are people who live a combination of a hermit existence and a slight amount of community. So that would be like the groups Anthony, the big group Anthony formed at the bottom of the cliff, where we see his monastery today. So these people would have a significant amount of period alone as a hermit and come together possibly once a week for a Eucharistic service. So in the Roman Church, the most well-known group are called Carthusians, and they live in places. Their common house is called a charter house. The most famous is the Grande Chartreuse in France. Maybe you know their liquor, okay, because one of the ways they support themselves is they make a certain liquor called chartreuse. But yeah, there are also, there's a charter house in England and West Sussex at Parkminster. So there are people who live a very similar existence. And yeah, I mean, there's lots more we could note, and we could note monks of other religious traditions too, like Buddhism and so on, if we were talking about hermits in general. If you want to look at a movie about this type of life, there's a famous one called Into Great Silence. I think it's on YouTube. In the United States, the Carthusians are only one place that I know of so far in Vermont, but Camaldolese are a little bit, a tiny less strict, and they are right here in California, among other places. So there are Camaldolese in California, in Big Sur, and this is a view of their monastery, and it gives you the idea. You can actually see the structure, see how they live in individual little places. And then this would be their chapel in the center, where they would come together for an occasional mass, possibly once a day or possibly on Sunday, something like that. So those are Camaldolese. That's an Italian term. So it's named for the location in Italy, New Camaldoli. You can actually go here. You can drive up, except the highway around Big Sur is often collapsing, right? But you can drive up here and you can go into their bookstore and you can maybe talk to one of them if you ever wanted to meet literally a modern hermit. Okay, so we end where we started. And I also have one more question, and that is the general purpose of Thebaid to recruit more monks or show life in monasteries so common that people could understand it? Probably some of each, but probably mostly inspiration. So telling their stories to the new monks, or if it's in a family place, telling stories to the families to inspire Christian actions, charity, and so on in new generations. So yeah, they're teaching. These are teaching type of pieces of art. Hey, I want to thank you all, and see you at future lectures, I hope. Okay,
Yes.
bye-bye.
Thank you, Dr. Gilman, for the great tour. And then just before everyone goes, we do remind you that all of these lectures are available to watch on our Facebook page. So at any time, if you'd like to go back and watch those, they are available. So yeah, thank you guys for joining our presentation today, and we'll see you in 2 weeks for our next one. Thanks a lot.